Greetings, Pastor Jeremy again here with our Daily Bread Bible study, and I'm excited. I'm ready to go because this is day number 1. This is for January 1st, 2020, and we are reading the first 4 chapters of Genesis. So before we get started, just from a perspective to say that I look at the book of Genesis, just like a lot of the rest of the books, and seeing that, that some people say that Moses is the one that authored all of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and that his hands even accounted for writing down his own account of his own death. So I focus on it, I guess, more from a literary standpoint of saying that it appears, especially through the scholarship, that there tends to be a couple different, writers of this story. But so I'll just throw out my personal bias there when it comes to looking at, this piece of scripture. I don't think that detracts away from any of the holiness of it. I think that just helps us be able to understand where I'm coming from when I look at a story like Genesis. And especially the first couple of chapters, because if we look at chapter 1 and we look at chapter, kind of the second, little after the first few verses of chapter 2, but as we look at chapter 2, we see 2 accounts of the creation narrative, which both seem kind of different. Like in the chapter 1, we notice that God creates, this humanity and is kind of creating all of creation, and humanity is kind of at the end of the creation of things. God is this strange form, hovering over the water, and this primordial chaos that's going on, that God is creating the heavens and the earth is formless and void, that it has not been structured. And so it's the story of God structuring this and creating different separations, different boundaries in which the world will operate with. Whereas in the chapter 2, we see that God is getting down and dirty, taking some mud and taking his hands and molding up this clay. Instead, in the first chapter, God just speaks and light appears, and God speaks and it happens. And the belovedness that God has in pronouncing this whole world that he created as good is he just says it and it is good. In the second chapter, we look and see God forming it with his hands and breathing the breath of life into these humans, and these humans kind of getting to figure out what it means to be human and to live in this world, and Adam feeling alone, but being able to have God care about that and create Eve from his own body parts that he created. So it's fascinating the ways in which these 2 accounts are very different from one another, but yet still try and explain and what's happening as far as creation goes, and how we as humanity came to exist here. So it's fascinating in that way, shape, and form. As we look a little bit more, and we look into chapter 3, we get to see a little of the problem that comes in with the first family there, as we focus on Adam and Eve, these 2 individuals, male and a female, as the author sees that, that is the expression of what humanity looks like. It's a male figure and a female figure as complementary parts to one another. And so as this male and this female figure are there, they are allowed to go in the Garden of Eden and to go around and explore and enjoy all the bounty that God has provided for them, that this God who loves them and cares for them. And they accept that. They take it in and are grateful and appreciative that God is doing that. But in chapter 3, then we get into one of the first challenges, another voice comes up, the voice of the serpent, and it comes up and says, well, maybe God's voice isn't what we have to always listen to. And so the serpent convinces Eve that she will not die quite in the way that she expects from God, and that she will in fact know good and evil, and that's something to be desired. And so then the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. She thought about it a lot, and she took the fruit and ate, and then gave to her husband. And just like, I think I fall guilty of this too. My wife does most of the cooking in the household, and she thinks a lot about preparing food for our kids and being intentional about that. And I'm the one who just kind of takes and eat. That's exactly what Adam did. He didn't have the criteria or the thoughts to think through all of the things like Eve did. It wasn't documented that he would do that. Now, I know that's quite silly because he chooses to do it. He knows good and well he shouldn't eat from that, but I just find it funny that his first impulse is to not question things and just eat. And Eve's impulse is really wrestling, struggling with, what does it mean to eat this? So, anyways, they come and both eat. And then they realize that that's not something that they should have done. And they have an awareness of their own sin and their own nakedness. And they try and hide themselves from God, which in this kind of strange vision we have in Genesis 1, this God is floating over the earth, and God is kind of omnipresent, hovering. And in the second one, God is like walking in the garden. God is more of a human-esque form, walking around and interacting with them. And God is surprised that they aren't there, that they're hiding from him. Either God may know that that's happening, or it seems like God is surprised by that. So what is that about if we, as Christians, maintain this concept of a fully omnipotent, omniscient God that we have come to receive through our theological lenses? But we look at this and see that the first couple has some dysfunction, and in their chance to unify together and say that we as individuals made this decision to be united as humanity, what do? They point fingers. Adam points fingers at Eve saying, well, she gave it to me. And Eve points fingers at the serpent saying, well, the serpent told me this. And so the fatal flaw of humanity comes out right in this first, family. As God is creating it, we choose to ignore, and we choose to follow our own ideas or hear voices that are not God's voices. And that's what leads to, as I've talked about in my overview, the sense of suffering that will come, with that. Is that there's a consequence from that. Now they know. And now they will, in some sense, be banished from the Garden of Eden. So that way they have to live in this world, and they have to endure pains through both physical labor and also childbearing labor. And they have to live in this world and go on, figuring that out. But even still, the grace of all of this is that God still cares for them. God still cares for humanity, even though God is frustrated that they made a poor decision. That God cares and acts and clothes them and meets their needs and then sends them out of the garden. We pick up in chapter 4 that Adam and Eve, are able to have offspring, and they have Cain and Abel, two brothers. It says here that Abel as the keeper of the sheep and Cain as the tiller of the ground. And when offered this sacrifice, that it shows this kind of God who is maybe a little bit partial. It's kind of strange in my theological lens because I'm big on God accepting and affirming all creation, and especially looking at things through the lens of Jesus, in which Jesus died not for one individual but for the whole world, and to provide for us the way to life, and give that freely to all humanity. But here we have God kind of picking. We have God picking an offering. So God picks Abel's offering, the firstlings of his flock and the fat portions, and then God kind of refuses what Cain has to offer. And then God says, to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door, the problem of humanity that God has already seen. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. And so God is calling Cain to make a choice in his frustration, to make a good choice, to turn to God, to listen to God's voice, instead of this own jealousy that's coming up within inside himself. But anyways, Cain eventually plots and takes his brother's life and kills him. And that we see that Cain gets found out by God, of course, because Abel's not walking around anymore. God sees that Cain has killed Abel and has to punish him like a parent, to have to hold him accountable for a consequence of doing that, for violating the sanctity of life and for destroying one of his other creations, one of the first families. So the first family, the wife and the husband, kind of point fingers and try and blame one another. The first brothers, one of them kills another and ends a life. And so things are not going very well for humans at this point in time. But God still is trying to preserve and care for God's creation. And that's where we end at chapter 4.